Some men spend their whole lives waiting to be tested, waiting for the moment that proves what kind of person they are. The big, dramatic moment. The burning building, the courtroom. The crisis that announces itself with music and clear stakes. I used to think I was one of those men. Turns out the test I'd been preparing for my whole life wasn't dramatic at all. It was a Monday morning in October, a hip replacement, and 3 phone calls that never came. My name is Frank Hale. I am 64 years old. I run a small auto repair shop on Glenmore Avenue in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I have been the kind of man who shows up first and leaves last at everything that matters. I fix things for a living. Engines, transmissions, differentials, things that are broken and need a patient hand, and enough hours to do the job right. I have never once left a car on a lift half finished. I want you to understand that about me before anything else, because it matters more than anything I'm about to tell you. Welcome to Dad's Raw Revenge. Get comfortable, because this one is going to take you somewhere. Drop a comment, and let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button, and make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, you're going to love it here. Now let me tell you about my mother. Her name is Loretta Cahill. She turned 81 in September. She lives in the same house on Sycamore Lane in Hyde Park that she and my father bought in 1974, the year I was 10 years old. A 2-story brick colonial with a white porch and a garden that has always been better kept than anything on the block, because Loretta Cahill has never once done anything halfway. My father passed 19 years ago, a Saturday morning in March, and she handled it the way she handled everything, with her chin up, her bills paid on time, and her garden planted on schedule that spring, because she said the tulips didn't know what happened and she wasn't going to punish them for it. That's her. That was always her. She made her own decisions, kept her own schedule, drove herself to every appointment well into her 70s, and was the first person any of us called when we needed to know what to do. She was not a woman who required managing. She was a woman who required respect. The hip had been an argument she'd been losing for about 2 years. Her doctor, a straightforward man named Dr. Paul Brennan at Good Samaritan Hospital on Clifton Avenue, had been telling her since the previous fall that the joint was bone on bone and was only going to get worse. She nodded politely at every appointment and gone home and planted her spring bulbs and made her Tuesday dinners and otherwise completely ignored him, which is exactly what I would have done at 81. She finally agreed in early September, after a morning where the pain got bad enough that she sat down on the porch step and couldn't get up for 20 minutes without the railing. She called me from that porch step. Not my children. Me. I want you to hold that. I have 3 children. Sandra, 41, married, lives in Blue Ash, about 20 minutes from Sycamore Lane. Marcus, 38, lives in Norwood, 12 minutes. Diane, 35, the youngest, lives in Madeira, 18 minutes away. All 3 of them, at various points in the 5 weeks between Loretta's surgical consult and her procedure date, told me they would help. Not because I asked, because they volunteered. Sandra called me on a Sunday evening in September, her usual checking-in call, and said, "Dad, we're going to work out a rotation. Between the 3 of us, we can make sure Grandma has somebody every day while she recovers. We've already talked about it. Marcus and Diane are both on board. I want you to be able to focus on the shop and not have to carry this alone." I'm writing it down right now. I remember exactly what I said. I remember it because I replayed it many times since, looking for the place where I should have known. I said, "Sandra, that means everything to me." That's all I said. That means everything to me. Because it did. Because I had raised 3 children in the belief that family shows up, and here was evidence that it had taken. I went to bed that night, feeling like a man who'd gotten something right. My mother's surgery was Thursday, October 3rd. Dr. Brennan performed a total right hip replacement at Good Samaritan Hospital. She was in the OR at 7:15 in the morning, and I was in the waiting room before 7 o'clock. Coffee from a machine near the elevator that tasted exactly like the idea of coffee in a green plastic chair that had never once been comfortable for anyone. She came through well. Dr. Brennan found me at 10:40 and said she'd done fine, that her vitals were strong, that a woman her age with her overall health had every reason to expect a full recovery with the right postoperative care. He said that phrase twice. Postoperative care. I understand now that he was telling me something specific, not just filling time. She spent 2 nights in the hospital. I was there both days. Marcus came by Saturday afternoon for 45 minutes, which I noted because he'd promised to come both days. Diane sent flowers to the room, which was a nice gesture and not what I had pictured when Sandra said rotation. Sandra was managing a work situation, she'd said when I called, but she'd be there for the homecoming. She wasn't there for the homecoming. Monday, October 7th, 10:22 in the morning. I picked Loretta up from Good Samaritan in my 2007 Ford F-150 Burgundy, 312,000 miles. Sounds like it's thinking about retirement but hasn't committed yet. She came out in a wheelchair, hospital policy, which she had been complaining about since Sunday. She stood up from it the second the automatic doors cleared, smoothed her coat, and looked at the parking lot like it owed her an apology for the inconvenience. I held the passenger door. She climbed in slowly, carefully, without help, because independence was the last thing Loretta Cahill was going to surrender to a hip replacement or anyone else. On the drive home, I told her about the rotation. Sandra, Marcus, Diane. Somebody every day. She looked out the window at the Cincinnati skyline and didn't say anything for a moment. Frank, her voice was careful. You asked them to do this? They volunteered, Mom. She looked out the window again. That's a long pause. I got her settled at Sycamore Lane, made chamomile tea, the specific kind she kept in the cabinet by the stove, and steeped it exactly 4 minutes because that was the right amount and she told me once and I hadn't forgotten. Checked the refrigerator, made a grocery list, went through Dr. Brennan's discharge instructions one item at a time while she sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around her mug and nodded at things she'd already memorized. I arranged her medications on the counter in the order she'd take them. I set up the bathroom grab bar Marcus had ordered, which had arrived by courier because Marcus himself had not. I was there until early afternoon. When I left, I squeezed her hand at the door and told her Sandra would be by in the morning. Sandra did not come Tuesday morning. She texted me at 8:47 to say the work thing had gotten complicated, but she'd definitely be there Wednesday. I drove to Sycamore Lane myself, got Mom's breakfast, helped her with the exercises Dr. Brennan's team had sent home, and left at noon because I had a transmission job that had been waiting 3 days. I called Mom that evening. She said she was fine. She said it in the specific way that means, I'm fine, and I'm not going to tell you otherwise. Wednesday, Sandra texted again. The work thing. Thursday, Marcus was going to come by, but something came up with the kids. I drove to Sycamore Lane again. Friday, Diane had a conflict she said she felt terrible about. I drove to Sycamore Lane. Saturday, Sandra sent a card. I want you to understand what I mean by a card. A card with a stamp, on paper, mailed to an 81-year-old woman recovering from major surgery 4 miles from Sandra's front door. Sunday was day 9. I pulled into the driveway on Sycamore Lane at 9:15 in the morning, and I sat in my truck for a moment before going inside. The October light was flat and gray, the kind that makes Cincinnati look like it's deciding whether to bother. The tulip beds along the front walk, her pride, were cleaned up for fall, but the top step had a thin film of wet leaves nobody had swept. I noticed that because Loretta Cahill did not leave wet leaves on her steps, it meant she couldn't get to them and hadn't wanted to ask. I went inside. She was at the kitchen table with her crossword. Good color, moving carefully but moving. I swept the front steps before I even said good morning. She watched me through the window and didn't say anything when I came in, just handed me coffee that she had already made, which meant she'd been standing at the counter on her recovering hip because I hadn't gotten there early enough. Mom, I said, you should have called me. I would have come earlier. She sat back down. I don't need to call you, Frank. I sat across from her. She went back to her crossword. We drank our coffee. The kitchen was quiet the way her kitchen has always been quiet, a particular kind of settled silence that belongs to a house that's been well lived in. The refrigerator hummed. The clock above the sink moved through its slow business. After a while, without looking up from the crossword, she said, They haven't come. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation. It was just a statement, the way she stated facts. Flat, certain, already filed. I know, Mom. She filled in a letter. Have any of them called you? I put my mug down. She looked up over her glasses. I see. She went back to the puzzle. I watched her, 81 years old, hip freshly replaced, getting her own breakfast, making her own coffee, sweeping her own steps when she could manage it, and leaving them when she couldn't. Not because she didn't want help, because the people who'd said they'd come hadn't come, and Loretta Cale was not going to sit by the phone performing helplessness for an audience that wasn't there. Something in me closed quietly, like a door at the end of a long hall. Not anger, not the hot rush of a man who's been let down and needs to make noise about it. Something much quieter than that, much more permanent. I didn't say a word about it. Not to her, not to any of them. I texted Sandra that afternoon. Hey, checking in. Everything okay your end? She replied, yes. So, sorry, this week has been insane. I'll be there soon. I replied, no rush. Mom's good. That was the last time I answered a text from any of them about my mother. I want to be honest about something. The decision I made that Sunday at the kitchen table on Sycamore Lane was not a decision I made in anger, and I want to be clear about that, because anger makes bad architecture. It builds crooked. Everything it constructs leans. What I made at that table was more like a calculation, the kind I make in the shop when I've looked at an engine long enough to understand that the damage isn't in one part, but in the system, that the problem isn't one missed oil change, but 15 years of the wrong habits, and that what's needed isn't a patch, but a full rebuild from the pan up. I had 3 children who had promised, loudly, voluntarily, without anyone asking, to show up for their grandmother during 2 of the most vulnerable weeks of her life. It was day 9. Not one of them had come. My mother had stopped asking. That told me everything I needed to know about both the system and what had to happen next. I drove home that Sunday evening on Montgomery Road, and I did not turn on the radio. I let the drive be what it was. If you've been listening for a while, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing, and it means everything to us. Hit the like button while you're at it, and drop your thoughts in the comments. That evening I called an old friend named Roy Sutter. Roy and I went to high school together, graduated the same year, 1979. He spent 30 years as a claims investigator for an insurance firm and retired to a place in Anderson Township with a workshop he cared about more than his pension, which was saying something. He was the kind of man who made you feel like your problem was the most important thing in the room without ever saying a single thing that was false. I called him at 7:30. He picked up on the second ring. Frank, his voice was easy. What's going on? I drove out to Roy's place the next morning. Monday, October 14th, 8:15 a.m. I sat at his kitchen table with actual good coffee, which he made in a French press he treated with more care than most people treat relationships, and I laid out 9 days in plain language. The surgery, the rotation, Sandra's texts, Marcus's 45 minutes, Diane's flowers, the wet leaves on the front step, my mother at her crossword not asking. Roy listened without interrupting, which was his way. When I finished, he set down his mug and looked at me for a moment. Has she said she wants to do anything? About the will, the house, any of it? Not to me, I said. Not yet. Roy nodded. Does she have an attorney? Walter Grimes, I said. He's been her attorney for about 22 years. Handled my father's estate. Handles her documents. Roy picked up his mug again. Frank, I'm going to say something once and then drop it. Go ahead. Your mother is 81. She recovered from major surgery in a house that she was alone in for 9 consecutive days. She's sharp as a tack, and she's watching. He looked at me. She already knows what she wants to do. She's just waiting to see if you're going to tell her it's okay to do it. I drove to Sycamore Lane from Roy's house. 9:47 in the morning. Mom was on the porch, which she wasn't supposed to be, but it was a mild October day, and Loretta Cale had never once let a discharge instruction overrule good judgment about fresh air. She was in her good coat, the navy one she'd had for years, sitting in the porch chair with a cup of tea going cold on the railing beside her, looking at her tulip bed the way she looked at things she was thinking about. I sat down in the other porch chair. Neither of us said anything for a minute. Then she said, Frank, I'd like to call Walter this week. I said, I'll drive you. She nodded, looked back at the tulip bed. I want to update a few things. She said it the way she said everything, simply, without performance, without asking my opinion on whether it was a good idea. She was 81. She'd spent 81 years building a precise understanding of what was worth holding on to. She did not need my permission. I want to be clear that I did not push this. I want to be clear that I did not suggest it, encourage it, or indicate in any way what she should do or not do with her own estate and her own life's work. What I did was sit in a porch chair on Sycamore Lane and be present for a woman who had spent 9 days being present entirely alone. That was all. Walter Grimes had his office on Erie Avenue in Hyde Park, for minutes from Sycamore Lane. He'd been her attorney since she was 59. He was 74 now, semi-retired, but he kept a small practice, and he'd told her years ago that as long as she needed him, he'd be there. His assistant called back within the hour. Mr. Grimes could see her Thursday at 10 a.m. perfect, she said. Wednesday evening, October 16th. Sandra called me for the first time in 4 days. Not about my mother. She called to tell me about a dinner she was planning for Thanksgiving, venue she was thinking, whether I bring anything. She talked for 11 minutes. She did not ask about Loretta once. I said the right things. I did not mention Sycamore Lane. Underscore, 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 underscore. Part 2, Acts 5-7. Walter Grimes had a particular stillness of a man who had been listening to people's most important business for decades and knew that the quality of his silence was more valuable than most of what he could say. He was a tall man, thin, with wire-rimmed glasses, and the careful, deliberate movements of someone who decided a long time ago that rushing was for people who hadn't thought things through. He shook my hand at the door of his office on Erie Avenue, shook my mother's hand, and guided her to the chair across from his desk with a quiet attentiveness that told me he understood exactly what kind of woman had come see him. I sat in the corner, the same way I'd been sitting in corners and watching for 9 days. Witness, not participant. He looked at her across the desk. Mrs. Cahill, how are you feeling? Better every day, Walter. She set her hands in her lap. I'm not here about the hip. I see. He settled back in his chair, folded his hands. What would you like to do? What followed was a conversation I will not reproduce in full, because it belongs to her and not to this story. But I will tell you its shape. She spoke for a long time, clearly, without drama, without any performative grief people sometimes bring to rooms like this. She was not angry. She was precise. She talked about the house on Sycamore Lane, which she and my father had paid off in 2003. She talked about the investment accounts my father had built over 31 years at his job, which had grown steadily since his death under her careful management. She talked about specific items. Her mother's jewelry, my father's watch collection, 3 pieces of furniture that had been in the family since before I was born. She talked about what she wanted those things to mean and where she wanted them to go. And she talked about the Cincinnati Animal Rescue Alliance on Madison Road, where she had volunteered every second Wednesday for 11 years, and where she wanted to leave something specific and meaningful. Walter Grimes wrote everything down in a legal pad with careful handwriting, and asked clarifying questions in the right places, and never once made her feel as though she was doing something unusual, because she wasn't. She was doing exactly what a woman her age, with her history, had every right to do with a clear mind and sufficient cause. When it was done, he looked up. Mrs. Cahill, I want to make sure I understand the scope of the changes. This is a significant restructuring. I know what I'm doing, Walter. She was pleasant about it. She was always pleasant. But there was no room in the sentence for discussion. He nodded. I'll have the revised documents ready for your review by Monday. He looked at her. I'd like you to review them carefully and make sure everything reflects exactly what you intend. She smiled. Walter, I've been intending this since day 9. He looked at her a moment, then at me, then back at her. He made a note. I want to tell you about the 2 weeks that followed because they mattered and because I was careful. I kept going to Sycamore Lane every day. I had been going every day, and I continued, because my mother needed daily support and because I hadn't changed. I swept her steps. I refilled her prescriptions. I drove her to 2 follow-up appointments with Dr. Brennan, who was pleased with her progress and less pleased, I sensed, with her cheerful indifference to his instructions about overdoing it. I made her grocery runs. I fixed the back gate latch that had been loose since August, which was not hip recovery related, but which I'd been meaning to do for months and finally had the time. I did not discuss Walter Grimes with my children. I did not discuss the will. I did not change the way I spoke to any of them, because I was not managing a story. I was taking care of my mother. Sandra came to Sycamore Lane on day 12, a Tuesday, October 18th, for 30 in the afternoon. She brought a casserole and a gift bag with a scented candle, and a card that said, "Thinking of you." She stayed 40 minutes. She spoke brightly about how great my mother looked and how the house looked wonderful and how she felt just terrible that she hadn't been able to get by sooner. This month had just been absolutely insane. My mother thanked her for the casserole and the candle and was entirely gracious because Loretta Kale had never once in her life been impolite to someone standing in her kitchen. What she did not do was tell Sandra anything about Walter Grimes or Erie Avenue or what had been decided in that office. Sandra did not ask how the recovery had actually gone. She talked about herself for 20 of the 40 minutes. I watched my mother refill the tea kettle, and I said almost nothing. Marcus came on day 14. He brought a fruit basket. He stayed 30 minutes and spent about 8 of them on his phone. Diane called on day 15 and said she had been just so worried, and she was going to come as soon as her schedule opened up, which was kind. Monday, October 21st. The revised documents arrived from Walter Grimes by courier. My mother read them at the kitchen table, in her coat, because she'd been outside and hadn't taken off yet, with her reading glasses and her deliberate attention, the same attention she gave to everything. She read every word. I sat across from her and drank my coffee and did not rush her. She looked up after 12 minutes. She turned the last page over. "This is right," she said. She signed where Walter's assistant had tabbed. She signed clearly, steadily, with the same handwriting she'd used for 81 years. Then she folded her hands on top of the documents and looked at me. "The house goes to you, Frank." She said it plainly. "The accounts, split 3 ways, with your third to you directly and the other 2/3 held in trust administered by you for the benefit of the family, at your discretion. The jewelry and the furniture as specified, and the $22,000 to the Alliance." I didn't say anything for a moment. "22,000, Mom?" 11 years, she said. $1 a year for every year I showed up. She looked at me. I thought that was the right number. I looked at her, this small, precise, magnificent woman in her navy coat with her reading glasses and her signed documents and her complete untroubled certainty. 11 years of second Wednesdays of the Animal Rescue, and she'd done the math. "Is that all right?" she asked, though she clearly didn't need my answer. "Mom," I said, "it's more than all right." She slid the documents back into the envelope. "Walter will file them this week." She picked up her tea. "Now, are you staying for lunch or not?" I stayed for lunch. The documents were filed Wednesday, October 23rd. Walter Grimes's office sent confirmation copies to the named parties and institutions as required. There is a standard notification process when a will is substantially revised, and it operates on its own timeline, whether anyone wants it to or not. Sandra called me the following Tuesday, October 29th, 11:14 in the morning. I was under a Subaru on the lift, the specific moment you most want your phone to ring. I finished the inspection, wiped my hands, and called her back at 11:43. "Dad." Her voice had a different quality than I was used to. The bright social confidence she usually carried was somewhere else. "Is it true? Did Grandma actually?" She paused. "Did she change her will?" "The documents are filed," I said. "Dad." She didn't have to do that. I was going to come. I know I should have come sooner, but it was a genuinely hard month, and I thought someone else was handling it. I thought Marcus was. I waited. "Dad." Sandra's voice shifted again, lower now, more careful. "Did you tell her to do this?" I looked out through the shop window at Glenmore Avenue. October light on the storefronts across the street, the dry cleaner, the hardware place, the flower shop that had been there since I was a kid. Flat and clear and honest. "Your grandmother is 81 years old," I said. "She reads at graduate level and runs her own finances and keeps a better garden than anyone I've ever met. She made her own decision in her own time with her own attorney." I wasn't in the conversation. I was in the corner. A silence. "But you knew." I said, "I drove her to Erie Avenue." Another silence. Longer. Marcus called me that afternoon. Marcus's call was shorter and more direct, which was his way. He asked if I could talk to Grandma, explain that they'd meant to come, that it wasn't that they didn't love her. I said, Marcus, you can tell her yourself. She's at home on Sycamore Lane. She's in the book. He was quiet for a moment. Then, did you at least try to stop her? I said, no, son, I didn't. Diane's call came Wednesday morning. She cried a little, which was genuine. I believe that. And she said she felt horrible. She really did. She knew she let Grandma down and she was going to call her and apologize. I said that sounded like a good start. She asked me if I was angry at them. I thought about it for a moment. No, I said, honestly, I'm not angry. Angry was never the right temperature for this. Angry would have made me say things that didn't need saying and done things that needed more time. What I am is clear. She said, what does that mean? I said, it means I know who showed up and who didn't. And your grandmother knows. And that's all it means. I want to tell you how things stand now, because I think the ending matters as much as the story. My mother is doing well. Dr. Brennan cleared her for full activity in December, which she had already been performing since November, but was polite enough to let him officially announce. She is back in her garden. She is back at the Alliance on second Wednesdays. She makes her Tuesday dinners, and she keeps her own schedule, and she is entirely, completely herself. Sandra came to Sycamore Lane in November. She sat at the kitchen table with my mother, and they talked for a long time, and I wasn't there for it and don't know everything that was said. What I know is that my mother was gracious, as she always is, and honest, as she always is, and that what she told Sandra was not said in anger or bitterness, but in the same plain, honest voice she used for everything. Sandra called me after, and she was quiet in a way I hadn't heard from her before. She said, Grandma told me she wasn't disappointed in me. She said she was just accurate about me. I said, yeah, that sounds like her. Sandra said, that's worse than disappointed. I said, I know. Marcus and Diane both visited before Thanksgiving. Both conversations went the way conversations go when people are trying to rebuild something they didn't realize they damaged. Slowly, with some discomfort. The right way, the will stands as written. That's not my decision to revisit, and it wasn't my decision to make in the first place. My mother built something over 81 years of showing up, and she decided where it should go, and I think she was right. I think she is almost always right. She has certainly been right about me more times than I deserved. What I know, sitting here now, is this: patience is not the same thing as passivity. I did not storm into anyone's house. I did not make speeches. I did not threaten or plead or negotiate. I drove a burgundy Ford truck to Sycamore Lane every day for 14 days, and I swept steps, and I made tea, and I sat in the corner of an attorney's office and let a woman who had spent her whole life showing up decide, one final time, who deserved to be in the room when it mattered. That is all I did, and it turned out to be exactly enough. Some people confuse quiet for weakness. They look at a man who doesn't shout and assume he hasn't decided anything yet. My mother never made that mistake. She always knew the difference between a man who hadn't acted and a man who was simply waiting to act until the moment was right. 41 calls, 14 days, and a casserole that arrived when it was no longer needed. The people in this story had every chance to behave themselves. Loretta Cahill just finally stopped waiting for them to. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of Dad's Raw Revenge. I will see you on the next one.